In the popular imagination, ancient Rome is remembered for its power and pageantry, the marble temples, the triumphal processions, the grandeur of emperors and their wives. We picture noble brides adorned in fine garments, carried to their new homes amidst celebration, entering marriages that symbolized alliances between dynasties. But behind this carefully staged splendor lay a truth far more unsettling. For many Roman women, even queens and empresses, the wedding night was not a promise of union, but a source of dread. Marriage in Rome was not primarily about affection. It was a contract, a political arrangement designed to secure alliances, wealth and heirs. And for women, especially those bound to powerful men, their role was clear: to submit. The rituals of the wedding emphasized not tenderness, but obedience. From the symbolic gestures of being carried across the threshold to the forced cutting of hair, everything marked the bride's transformation from person to property. And when night fell, fear often replaced celebration. The consummation of marriage was less an act of intimacy than a display of dominance. Consent was rarely considered. The young bride, sometimes still a teenager, was expected to surrender her body, not because she wished to, but because law and custom demanded it. Even queens and empresses, draped in gold and laurel, were not exempt from this terror. Their bodies were political instruments, their private lives a matter of state. To fail in this role meant humiliation, suspicion, even ruin. This is the hidden story of Roman weddings, nights veiled not in romance but in silence, fear, and the weight of power, preparing the bride. Marriage in Rome was never simply a private matter between two individuals. It was a public institution, a ritual woven into the very fabric of society. For the bride, the day began not with joy, but with transformation. She was no longer her father's daughter. She was becoming part of another household, another line, another destiny. The preparations spoke this truth silently, through symbols embedded in every garment and gesture. The bride was clothed in a long white tunic, tied at the waist with a knot, the nodus Herculaneus, or knot of Hercules. This knot was said to be difficult to untie, symbolizing chastity and the permanence of union. Yet it was also a reminder: only the husband had the right to loosen it, only he could claim the body hidden beneath the fabric. Over her head was placed the flamen, a veil of deep orange red, the color of fire. Its brightness was striking, meant to conceal her identity and mark her as set apart. Fire symbolized purity, but also sacrifice, as though the bride herself were being offered, not unlike a ritual victim at an altar. In the eyes of Romans, this veil transformed her from a woman into a wife, ready to be handed from one man's authority to another's. Her hair, too, was altered. On her wedding day, it was divided into 6 braids, arranged in a style called senicrines. This was not merely an adornment, it was a hairstyle associated with the Vestal Virgins, priestesses of chastity and sacred fire. The irony was sharp. The bride was dressed like a guardian of eternal virginity, only to be delivered that night to the authority of her husband. The ceremony of transfer. Roman weddings were defined by transition. A woman did not simply change households, she was symbolically severed from her past. The act was marked by ritual gestures that carried unsettling meanings. When the moment came for the bride to leave her father's home, she was expected to cry. Her tears were part of the performance, an acknowledgement that she was being torn away. Sometimes she was even pulled from her mother's arms with exaggerated force, as if seized. This mock abduction symbolized the conquest of the bride by her new husband. It was a ritualized echo of ancient practices when wives were literally taken from enemy tribes. Then came the procession to her new household. Torches lit the way, musicians played flutes, and attendants sang hymns. Outwardly, it seemed a celebration, yet beneath the festivity was the reminder that the bride was leaving behind her world forever. Friends and relatives escorted her, but once she crossed the threshold, she would belong entirely to another family. At the door of her new home, the symbolism turned even more stark. The groom or attendants sometimes carried the bride across the threshold, not as a tender gesture, but to prevent her from tripping. For Romans, stumbling was an omen of bad luck, but it also revealed another truth. She was not entering of her own free will. The act of being carried, even dragged, underscored that her presence inside was determined by others, not by her choice. The threshold of obedience. Once inside, the bride was led to the hearth, the sacred fire of the household gods. There, she offered sacrifices, touching bread and water as signs of her submission to her husband's household. These acts were not symbolic of partnership, but of obedience. From this moment forward, her fate was tied to the domus of her husband under his legal power. The witnesses, relatives, and guests present all understood the message. The wedding was not a contract between equals, but a transfer of authority. In the old formula, the bride moved from the manus of her father to the manus of her husband, from one man's hand to another. She was no longer her own. And so even before the wedding night began, fear already lingered. Every garment, every ritual, every gesture told the bride she had been transformed from a person into a possession. The splendor of music and torches concealed the harsh truth. She was stepping not into a partnership, but into a life where her role would be obedience, her value measured by her submission, and her body subject to another's will. The law behind the bed. To understand why Roman brides feared their wedding night, one must begin with the law. In the Roman world, marriage was never framed as a partnership of equals. It was a contract, a connubium, designed to secure heirs and link households. The wife's body was not her own. It was, by custom and expectation, the property of her husband. The Roman legal concept of manus gave husbands sweeping authority. Though not every marriage placed the wife fully under manus, the expectation of obedience and sexual availability was universal. Once married, the bride's chastity was no longer her father's concern, but her husband's possession. Failure to consummate the union was not only a personal disappointment, but a legal and social failure, for the purpose of marriage was reproduction. This legal framework meant that on her wedding night, the bride's consent was irrelevant. Roman law recognized the act of consummation as a husband's right. A bride who resisted was not exercising agency. She was violating custom, dishonoring her family, and risking humiliation. Part 2. The first night as an act of possession. For the bride, the night itself was terrifying because it was not framed as intimacy, but as conquest. Ancient writers often described consummation in the language of battle. The husband was imagined as a victor, the bride as one conquered. The very word for marriage, nuptiae, was linked to rituals of seizure and domination. The mock abduction in the ceremony was a foreshadowing of what awaited in private, the physical assertion of power over her body. Young brides, sometimes as young as 14, were expected to endure this night in silence. Many were married to men decades older, seasoned politicians or generals who viewed their wives not as companions, but as instruments of lineage. For them, the wedding night was not about tenderness, but about ensuring the continuity of their bloodline. Accounts, though often muted, hint at the fear that permeated this moment. The red veil, the tears during the procession, the forced entry into the house, all these rituals prepared the bride for submission. When the torches were extinguished and the doors shut, she was alone with a man who by law and custom was entitled to her body. The silence of the bride. What makes the Roman wedding night so haunting is not only the act itself, but the silence surrounding it. Brides were expected to say nothing of what transpired. To speak of pain, fear, or violation was seen as dishonorable. Their role was to endure. Even queens and empresses, adorned in jewels and surrounded by attendants, faced this same silence. Their exalted status did not shield them from the ritual of submission. For them, the stakes were even higher. Their fertility was a matter of state. An empress who failed to conceive could be accused of weakness, infidelity, or even cursed by the gods. The The silence also extended into history. Roman sources rarely describe the feelings of brides. The male writers of antiquity, senators, philosophers, poets, focused on the pomp of ceremonies, the alliances formed, the legitimacy of heirs. The voices of the women themselves are almost entirely absent. Their wedding nights, marked by fear, exist only in fragments, hidden beneath the surface of official accounts. A night of contradictions. The Roman wedding night was thus both intimate and impersonal. Intimate because it involved the private union of two individuals. Impersonal because it was an act defined by law, ritual, and societal expectation rather than affection. For the bride, it was the threshold of her new life. The night marked not only the consummation of her marriage, but the beginning of a role she had not chosen. Bearer of heirs, guardian of reputation, symbol of obedience. For Roman queens and empresses, the night carried additional dread. Their bodies were not only private possessions but public instruments. They were expected to produce sons who could secure dynasties and daughters who could cement alliances. Failure to perform this role was not simply a disappointment, it was a danger. Many who failed were cast aside, exiled or destroyed. And so beneath the torches and songs, the Roman wedding night was not truly a night of union, it was a night of submission, silence and fear, the public face of a private bond. In Rome, marriage was not merely a union of two individuals, it was a transaction, a pact, an alliance sealed in flesh and blood. The bride's body became a vessel through which families exchanged power. For ordinary Roman women, this meant alliances between households. For queens and empresses, it meant the fate of dynasties. The pomp of the wedding concealed its purpose. The garlands, the torches, the veils, all symbols designed to mask the reality that a woman's marriage was rarely her choice. Her consent mattered little. What mattered was her family's standing, her husband's ambitions, and the state's demands. The emperor's wives. Some of the most famous figures in Roman history remind us that queens and empresses were not exempt from this reality.
Livia Drusilla, for instance, began her marriage to Tiberius Claudius Nero. She already had children when Octavian, soon to become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, demanded her hand. Livia was forced to leave her husband, still pregnant with another man's child, and marry Octavian. Her wedding night was not one of romance, but of political theater, a reminder that the body of an elite woman could be seized to legitimize a new dynasty.
Julia, the daughter of Augustus, fared no better. Used as a political pawn, she was married 3 times, each union carefully arranged to strengthen her father's alliances. Her private life was scrutinized relentlessly. Her fertility, her conduct, even her intimacy became matters of state. Her wedding nights, repeated with different husbands, were moments not of celebration but of dread, knowing that her body was less her own than her father's political weapon. The burden of fertility. For queens and noble women, marriage carried one essential expectation: produce heirs. This was not a private hope, but a public duty. The continuation of bloodlines, the legitimacy of succession, the stability of Rome itself, all were tied to whether a woman conceived. Failure to bear children, or worse, to bear only daughters, could doom a marriage. Empresses who did not produce heirs were sometimes accused of sorcery, infidelity, or divine disfavor. Their wedding nights, far from romantic beginnings, were the first test of a life defined by this burden. The case of Poppaea Sabina, wife of Emperor Nero, illustrates this vividly. Praised for her beauty, she was also judged entirely by her ability to give Nero an heir. She died tragically while pregnant, her body consumed by the demands of empire. For her, as for many others, the wedding night was not the start of a shared life, but the beginning of a dangerous trial she could never escape. Alliances and betrayals. Political marriages also exposed women to betrayal. Husbands discarded wives, not only for infidelity, but for convenience. To dissolve a marriage was to dissolve an alliance, and the woman herself was treated as collateral. In some cases, brides were handed from one man to another, not unlike hostages in the game of politics. Each new wedding night repeated the same pattern: the extinguishing of personal will, the imposition of a new master. Thus, for queens and empresses, the marriage bed was not a sanctuary but a battlefield. On that bed, dynasties were secured or destroyed, loyalties sealed or broken. To survive, it was to serve the state. To fail was to invite exile, disgrace, or even death. The duty to bear sons. In Rome, marriage had one ultimate purpose: children, more precisely sons. For queens and empresses, their value was measured not in their wisdom, not in their companionship, but in their ability to produce heirs who could secure dynasties. The Roman state did not cloak this expectation in gentleness. It was written into law, into custom, into the very meaning of marriage. The wedding night was thus not an end in itself, but the beginning of a trial. The bride entered her husband's bed as a vessel of hope for lineage. Each embrace carried a weight far beyond intimacy: the continuity of power, the stability of the throne, the legacy of Rome, the fear of failure. To fail in this duty was to risk everything. Infertility, or even the suspicion of infertility, could doom a woman's life. Roman men, especially emperors, had little patience for wives who did not bear children. Repudiation was common, exile not unusual, and whispers of infidelity could be manufactured to justify disgrace. Even those who bore daughters were not safe. Sons were the coin of dynastic survival. Daughters were often seen as secondary, useful only for political marriages. For an empress, giving birth to daughters could mean humiliation, whispered gossip, and the looming threat of being replaced. Bodies as battlegrounds. The bodies of Roman queens became battlegrounds of power. Every pregnancy was a public event, discussed in the streets, debated in the Senate, recorded by historians. Success or failure in the bedroom echoed across the empire. Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus, was revered not only for her political acumen, but for her role as mother of heirs. Her entire reputation and much of her influence rested on the children she bore and nurtured. To be a successful empress meant not only surviving palace intrigue, but proving fertility again and again. The tragic fate of Poppaea Sabina, wife of Nero, illustrates the peril. Celebrated for her beauty, she lived under constant pressure to give Nero a child. She died while pregnant, her life cut short by the very expectation that defined her. Her story reveals the brutal truth: even queens could die in service to Rome's insatiable need for heirs. The weight of reputation. The burden of fertility extended beyond the physical into the realm of reputation. Roman society was merciless in its judgments. A queen accused of promiscuity faced ruin, regardless of truth. A queen who failed to conceive faced whispers of divine disfavor, and a queen who bore a son faced the equally dangerous burden of securing his survival against rivals, poisons, and plots. Messalina, wife of Claudius, was remembered less for her political influence than for accusations of sexual excess, many likely exaggerated or fabricated. Faustina the Younger, wife of Marcus Aurelius, was similarly slandered despite her devotion to bearing and raising imperial children. Their reputations remind us that even fertility did not guarantee safety. A queen's honor could be torn apart by rumor as swiftly as her body was claimed by duty. Fertility as a chain. Thus, the wedding night was only the beginning of a lifelong trial. For queens and empresses, every embrace was weighed, every pregnancy scrutinized, every child judged. Their bodies were chained to expectations they could never fully escape. Even success brought little relief. A mother who bore sons lived under the shadow of succession struggles, fratricide, and political manipulation. A mother who bore daughters risked dismissal, and a mother who bore nothing at all could expect disgrace. In the end, the burden of fertility made the Roman marriage bed not a place of union, but of fear. A queen's body was both her greatest weapon and her greatest vulnerability, celebrated when it produced heirs, condemned when it did not, the husband's power. In Rome, marriage did not grant women protection from male authority, it placed them firmly within it. Even when not formally under manus, the social expectation was absolute obedience. A husband could repudiate his wife with ease, sending her back to her father's home in disgrace. He could accuse her of adultery, a crime punishable by exile, confiscation of property, or even death. For queens and empresses, this power was magnified by the political stage. Their reputations were not private matters but public theatre. A whisper of infidelity could ruin not only a marriage but an entire dynasty. The control of husbands extended beyond the bedroom, reaching into every aspect of a woman's life. Surveillance and suspicion. The life of a Roman empress was lived under watchful eyes. Servants, guards, attendants, all could become informants. Rivals within the palace might spread rumors claiming scandal where none existed. A single misstep, a private conversation, even the wrong gesture at a feast could be twisted into evidence of disloyalty. The marriage bed itself was sometimes seen as a political space, monitored indirectly by the Senate, courtiers or rival families. If an empress failed to conceive, suspicion fell quickly. Was she barren? Was she unfaithful? Was she cursed? In such a climate, trust was fragile and fear was constant. Violence behind closed doors. The Roman household was also a place where violence was sanctioned. Husbands held the right to discipline their wives, sometimes with brutal force. While laws occasionally sought to moderate extremes, the underlying reality remained: the wife had little legal recourse against abuse. Even empresses were not safe. Domitia Longina, wife of Domitian, endured humiliation and rumors of mistreatment, her position always precarious despite her title. Stories of imperial violence circulated, some exaggerated, others all too real, reminding us that power offered no guarantee of safety. The fate of Messalina, wife of Claudius, is one of the most chilling examples. Accused of outrageous sexual misconduct, likely inflated by enemies, she was executed without trial. Her marriage, once a platform of influence, became the stage for her destruction. Her story shows how swiftly fear could turn to death, how fragile the line between favor and annihilation truly was. The tyranny of reputation. In Rome, a woman's body was not her own, but neither was her reputation. Control extended beyond her physical life, into the realm of perception. A queen who lived modestly and bore heirs could still be torn apart by slander. Faustina the Younger, wife of Marcus Aurelius, bore many children and fulfilled her duties, yet was accused in later writings of promiscuity. Historians repeated rumors that cast her as unfaithful, regardless of truth. Reputation was a weapon wielded by men to control the narrative of women's lives. For Roman queens, the fear extended endlessly. Fear of failure in the bedchamber, fear of violence at home, fear of rumors in the palace, fear of history's judgment. Even in silence, even in obedience, they could not escape suspicion. Fear as a lifelong condition. Thus, the fear that began on the wedding night never truly ended. It lingered in the shadows of daily life, in the looks of servants, in the whispers of courtiers, in the threats of husbands. For ordinary Roman women, fear meant the risk of repudiation, disgrace or punishment. For queens and empresses, it meant the possibility of exile, execution, or the erasure of their names from history. The Roman marriage bed, then, was not a single moment of dread, but the beginning of a life lived under perpetual scrutiny. Queens feared their wedding nights because they knew the fear would not stop there. It would follow them, growing in new forms until it defined their very existence. The erasure of voices. When we look back at Rome, we hear the voices of generals, senators, poets, and philosophers. We read the speeches of Cicero, the histories of Tacitus, the poetry of Ovid. But the voices of the women, especially queens and empresses, are almost absent. Their words were rarely recorded, their feelings rarely described. What remains are fragments filtered through the pens of men who judged them by their obedience, their chastity, or their failure. The silence itself is a legacy. It reminds us that their fear was not just personal but institutional. Even their memories were controlled, shaped, and often erased by those who held power. The weight of ideals. Roman society celebrated the ideal of the matrona, the dutiful, obedient wife, modest in public, fruitful in the home. Statues and inscriptions praised women who fit this model, presenting them as embodiments of virtue. But these ideals concealed the suffering behind them. The reality of forced marriages, feared wedding nights, and lives controlled by husbands did not vanish because the state celebrated obedience. Instead, these ideals reinforced the silence, making it harder for women to speak of their fears. To be a good wife was to endure without complaint. Remembered through scandal. Ironically, many queens and empresses are remembered not for their strength or suffering, but for scandal. Messalina, Julia, Poppaea, their names often survive in history through accusations of lust, promiscuity, or treachery. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated, they served a purpose. They reinforced the narrative that women were dangerous when uncontrolled and therefore must be dominated. In this way, fear outlived their lives. It seeped into their legacies, ensuring that even in memory they remained subject to judgment. What their fear teaches us. The tragedy of Roman queens is not only that they lived in fear, but that their fear was normalized. It was woven into ritual, law, and custom. Their wedding nights, far from being beginnings of partnership, were rehearsals of submission. Their marriages were weapons of politics, their bodies instruments of fertility, their reputations tools of control. Yet to acknowledge this is not to erase their humanity. It is to see them more clearly as women who endured, who navigated impossible expectations, who sometimes found moments of influence but more often bore silence. Their legacy is a reminder that civilizations celebrated for their greatness often conceal shadows. Rome, the land of law and liberty, was also the land where liberty ended at the threshold of the bridal chamber. Closing reflection. And so, the fear of Roman queens on their wedding nights was not irrational. It was rooted in law, in custom, in politics, in the weight of expectation. It was the fear of losing selfhood, of being reduced to a role, of being remembered not for who they were, but for how they served. Their silence still echoes. It reminds us that history is not only what is written in marble, but also what is whispered in shadows, the stories of those who were meant to endure, not to speak. By remembering them, by unrolling these hidden scrolls of history, we restore fragments of dignity to lives overshadowed by fear.